Hey, thanks for joining us here at the LifePoint Church YouTube page. Really quick, before the message, 3 things that you can do. Number 1, subscribe. We want you to be the first to know when we're dropping new messages. Number 2, interact. Hop in the comments and chat with us. We want to do this thing with you. And number 3, share this message with someone you care about. And never forget, God loves you and He has a plan for you. Now enjoy the message.
Good morning, good morning. Thank you. Thank you. I'm joining you from just flew in from Florida. And I feel like yesterday was your version of Florida. And so that would be a cold front for us. But it was, I went outside a minute ago. Rusty said, come outside with me and let's greet. And I went outside and got pneumonia. I thought, good grief, what is it, like 50? So I actually have been here for a week. I've got my name's Jeremy Sims. If I didn't say, I think Colin said it, but I am a college professor. I'm a seminary professor. I lead a couple programs. In fact, I lead a doctoral program that your pastor is in right now. He's going to be, the jury's still out, but he wants to be a doctor here in the next year or so. And I wanted you to know that he's pretty much the valedictorian of the class. I mean, he set the tone and everyone's following in behind. And hey, will somebody make sure that's all Rusty wanted me to say about him? So I also lead a master's degree program, and we do intensives. And what that means is we go somewhere for about a week at a time. So I was on Orcas Island for the last week, which is beautiful. You guys already know that, but I was on Orcas Island, and we were at a retreat center overlooking the Puget Sound. And at night, you could go out on the deck and see the ski slopes of Vancouver. We were still in America, and I could see the ski slopes of Vancouver there on the back deck. And I caught hypothermia, but it was still really cool to be out there and see that. But it's a joy to be with you. It's an honor to be with you guys. My understanding is that this is the 3rd service. They saved the best for last, so fantastic. It's so fun to be with you. I'm honored that I get to kick off this sermon series on caves. This idea of where is God in the darkest moments of our life? Where is God? And so I am looking forward to sharing with you from the life of Jesus this morning in John chapter 11, which is where we'll be in just a few moments. Before I was a college professor, I was a pastor in the local church for 25 years. The last church that I was at for 19 years. I was an associate pastor, and I had a pastor named Jay West, who was also my brother-in-law. So brother-in-law and pastor Jay West, which is important that you remember his name. I would often call Jay, and I would use modern technology. You guys know how you can tell your phones to call someone. So sometimes I would do that. You guys say, hey Siri, I hope I made all your phones call, but you guys say, hey Siri, call whomever, right? But I have a confession to make. This is a very vulnerable thing for me to say to you, and that is, I'm an Android user. I use Android. Thank you. Fair enough. Yes, that's usually what I get. We are the most persecuted people on the planet, really, Android users. So I would say to the phone, hey Google, call somebody. So one morning, I wanted to call my brother-in-law Jay, who was also my pastor, and I said to him, hey Google, call Jay West. And I was driving down the road in the car, so I was on the Bluetooth, wasn't paying attention, and the phone rang, and a female picked up that I didn't recognize. It wasn't his wife, and I was like, oh, this is odd. I wonder who this is. And she said, thank you for calling Jay West. How may I help you? And I went, that's nice. I didn't realize Jay had an admin answering the phone now for him. Can I speak to Jay? And she says, there's no one here by that name. And I went, when I called, you said, you've called Jay West. She goes, that's right, you've called Jay West. How can I help you? I go, oh, great. Since I've called Jay West, can I speak to Jay West? And she says, there's no one here by that name. And I went, oh, you and I are like, well, I'm not sure what's happening right now. Do you hear the same words coming out of my mouth that are coming out of your mouth? Because we're both saying Jay West. That's right, Jay West. Can I speak to him? There's not even a male here. I said, can I speak to Jay? No, you may not. Ma'am, what's your name? She said, my name's Shelly. I said, hey, Shelly, you might feel as awkward about this moment as I do, and I just wanted to say, I'm trying to reach my brother-in-law. His name is Jay West. Where did I call? And she said, well, my name's Shelly. You've called Jay West, the bridal boutique in New York City, New York. I went, oh, that solves everything. And then I did I don't know if you've noticed the accent yet. I did what all of us Alabamians do. I overshared. I said, Shelly, I'm so glad that we figured this out. I didn't, I told the Google that I wanted it to call Jay West, who's my brother-in-law, and they rang you and you answered the phone, and then I was all confused, but it's so cool that how it worked out, and it was so funny, and I was very amused. She was not. She was not amused at all. She didn't care. She was really perturbed, to be honest. She and I had a very different experience. Not only did we have a different experience of enjoyment, she and I were using the exact same words, but talking a completely different language. The context of her Jay West and the context of my Jay West were two completely different things. And this morning, I want to look at a story of Jesus, and I want you to know that Jesus is, often, we think about him as an easily understandable teacher. But in this story, you're going to see Jesus is extremely hard to understand. He will be using the same words as the people around him, but the context from which he is speaking will be very different than the context from which they are hearing. In fact, Chris Green says this, theologian Chris Green says, we've been told that Jesus was a simple teacher, always talking in ways easily understood. In fact, however, there's not a single instance in the Gospels, not one, where he's truly understood by anyone. He's met always with disbelief, confusion, fury, disappointment, and even threats. Those who understand him best know that they don't understand him at all, and yet they stay close, drawing nearer. Jesus is the most misunderstood human that has ever walked the planet, and the reason is because he is always talking God, and the people around him are hearing human, and that's a very different language. So I want to set the stage for John chapter 11, where we'll be in the message this morning, and it is this. This is toward the end of Jesus' life. Some people even put this in the week before the Passion Week. They believe that it's right there. So Jesus has gone about 3 to 3.5 years of ministry. He is in a city now where he knows what is about to happen, and he's getting ready to go toward Bethany. Bethany is right next to Jerusalem, where they will arrest him and eventually kill him. And the last time he was in Bethany was where he got in a lot of trouble and almost was killed, and he was able to escape. So Bethany is a dangerous place for he and his apostles, and he knows it. In this story, someone sends word to Jesus that his friend Lazarus is sick. Jesus receives word, tells his apostles, Lazarus isn't sick, he's just asleep. We're going to go see him in a couple days, waits 2 days, and then the walk to get to him is another day. So, all that to say, John wants you to do some math and understand that when someone tells Jesus that Lazarus is sick, Lazarus has already died. So when Jesus goes, 4 days have passed, and John wants it to be very specific that you know that a lot of grieving and life and loss and suffering and pain has been experienced when Jesus shows up to Bethany. And that's where we pick up in John chapter 11, if you'll look there with me. John 11:17 says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Another way to read that, had already been in the cave for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Martha is grieving. She's been in this state for 4 days now, and if you've ever lost someone, you know that for the first day or two, there's usually some type of adrenaline rush where you can handle it, and then life hits you within the couple days. And you feel the weight of loss, and she's grieving. Grief is the response, it's the automatic response that all of us have toward loss. And Martha is grieving, and Mary is grieving, and they even have professional mourners that are helping them to grieve in this moment. Martha's having a very difficult time with this for a number of reasons, not the least of which, she knows that Jesus could have done something about it. She says to Jesus, "If you had been here, then my brother would not have died." Now, I want to remind you, this is the end of Jesus' earthly life. Martha and Mary have been a part of his ministry from the beginning, which means they've been with him for 3 to 3.5 years. They've watched him heal the sick, open blind eyes, heal those who are deaf, open the muted mouth. They've watched him release those who are demonized and demon-possessed into freedom. Matthew 9 tells us that there were several villages that Jesus went into, that every person that was brought to him that was sick, Jesus healed. He healed them all. And in the back of Martha's mind, all she can think is, you did all of that for all of these people that you don't even know, nameless and faceless, and you granted them life in their pain and their suffering, and you knew, I know you knew that Lazarus was sick, and you could have done something about it. If you had been here, then my brother would still be alive. Martha is angry. She's frustrated at Jesus. She's saying to him, deeply embedded in her words, what she's saying is, I've given my life to follow you. I've put my trust in you. I've invested my time into you. You owe me. You should have done something. You could have done something. And yet you let my brother die, and here we are, grieving his loss when you could have done something about it. Martha is doing something grieving, which all of us at some point in our lives are going to have to do if we haven't already, and that is respond to loss. In Americans, we here in America, we don't do loss very well. We have a deep aversion to pain. We will do anything it takes to escape the most painful thoughts and the most painful experiences that we can. There are people all around us and probably in this room, including me, that will do anything that I can to avoid a painful thought. I'll look at my phone longer. I'll go do something else. I'll get involved in other hobbies and sports. And I'll put noise in my life just so that I don't have to think about pain. We have a deep aversion to pain. We're scared of pain. We're scared of loss. In fact, several years ago, actually about 55 years ago, a book came out by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Maybe you have read it. It's called On Death and Dying. And in the book, she identifies the stages of grief. You might have heard of it before. She first identifies the 5 stages of grief, and about 10 years later adds a 6th stage. Maybe you've seen it before, but it's the acrostic DABDA. Have y'all seen that? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and then the 6th one that she would add later is meaning making, making it matter. DABDA. In 2011, my first wife, Tiffany, we had been married for 13 years, and she was diagnosed with Huntington's disease. I don't know if you've ever heard of Huntington's disease. It is a neurodegenerative disorder. It's an ugly disease. It's in the same family as ALS and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. In fact, some people say it's all 3 of those combined. She would fight that disease for 7 years before she died. And it was painful. Within the first year, she had started to get into some car accidents. And I had to go to her and I had to say, Tiff, you can't drive anymore. I don't know if you've ever had to do that. A lot of us have had to do that. It's a painful experience to tell someone, I'm going to take your freedom from you. That's what driving represents to a 16-year-old, right? Freedom. That's what driving represents to an 80-year-old. It's freedom. And I had to go to Tiff in the first year and say, baby, you can't drive anymore. In the second year, she was confined to a wheelchair where she would spend the last 6 years of her life in a wheelchair or laying down on a couch. In the third year, I was feeding her every meal because she couldn't hold a utensil. And in those moments, we experienced, by the way, we had 3 kids. When she was diagnosed, they were 7, 6, and 3. And in those 7 years, we experienced perpetual loss. We were losing 2 or 3 or 4 things every year. It was extremely painful. It was loss after loss after loss. And remember, I told you the response to loss is grief. So we were in a perpetual state of grief, always grieving. And I recognized after the fact some of those experiences that I had of denial and anger and bargaining and depression. I recognize those. The truth is they aren't linear. We don't necessarily go through them in order, and unfortunately, we don't graduate from one and never go back, but we cycle through them over and over and over. Denial showed up for me like this. A lot of times we think of denial as basically just like saying, this couldn't have happened, right? You hear bad news and you go, there's no way that's true. That's the most common way to think of denial, but denial for me showed up very differently. It showed up for me is my inability to recognize how painful and weighty what I was going through was. People would come to me and they'd say, hey, Jeremy, how are you doing? I'd be like, I'm doing good. I'm fine. That's a deflection. I wasn't doing fine. Oftentimes when someone asks you, how are you doing, if you're not doing well, that is our aversion to talking about the pain and weightiness of the emotion or the psyche of those things we're going through. So denial showed up for me that way. Anger showed up for me sometimes, especially for believers. Anger will show up to us kind of like Martha, where we're angry at God. Sometimes even a clenched fist. God, why are you doing this to me? Why are you letting this happen? For me, I didn't do it that way. Mine was more subtle and subconscious. I didn't catch it for years. But mine was, I just didn't want to be around God. I didn't pray as much. I didn't read scripture very often. And I didn't want to go to church, which is not good when you are a pastor. You do need to go to church sometimes. And I didn't want to go to church. I wanted to avoid God. I stiff-armed God. That was my anger. With bargaining, I remember saying, God, if you would just heal Tiff, I'll do anything for you. I'll do anything. That's how we bargain. Bargain is if then. If you would just do this, then I will do this. If you will heal her, then I will live for you forever. If then. This morning I want to give you 3 thoughts. I'm actually going to give you a lot of thoughts. We're going to put 3 of them on the wall here. But I want to give you 3 thoughts, and the first one is this. Jesus doesn't fit if then. Jesus doesn't fit if then. In your life, you could have said something like this, talking to God. If Jesus cared, then he would have healed my brother or my mom or my dad or my grandmother. They wouldn't be suffering right now, or they wouldn't have died. You might say, if God was real, there might be a person in this room this morning that said, if God was real, then he would alleviate all of the suffering and the hurting of the world. You might say, if I would have just prayed more, then God would have heard my request. Maybe there's a quota that if you hit, then God actually answers your prayer. And you're trying to figure out what the quota is. What's the limit? What's the line? How much do I have to pray to get God to move? If then. If I would fast more, I could get God to speak to me. If I would tithe more, then I could get God to bless me. If I would serve in God's kingdom, then God has to take care of my family. The problem with if then is an equation. It's a formula. It's this idea that I can move the hand of God by earning his favor. Scripture actually talks about if-thens and talks about equations, formulas that we use to move God. It's called witchcraft. Witchcraft is anything that I do to manipulate and manage the hand or the will of God. If I do this, if I pray this way, if I get up early enough, if I stay up late enough, if I serve at the church enough, then God has to do something good for me. And that's witchcraft. It's if-then. And Jesus doesn't fit in if-thens. He doesn't fit in equations. He doesn't fit in formulas. There's not enough that you and I can do that there will ever be a version that says God will look down and say, that's all I was waiting on now. I'm going to do what you want me to do. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Equations are our thoughts. Martha looks at Jesus and she says, if you had been here, then my brother would not have died. If you had cared, if you had listened, if you remembered how much you owe us, then Lazarus would still be alive. It's a transactional relationship. Jesus, I do this for you, and then you do this for me. In verse 23, we pick back up. It says, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? As confusing as you read that and are reading it right now and going, what in the world is he saying? That's exactly what Martha thought. Remember, they're saying the same words and they mean two completely different things. Martha says, yes, I know that Lazarus is going to rise again one day. I know it'll happen. It'll happen when the resurrection happens. And Jesus says, whoa, whoa, whoa. Resurrection's not an event. I am resurrection. I'm the resurrection. I am resurrection. This conversation gets interesting right here because you've got two people doing an Abbott and Costello routine. Who's on first? What's on second? I don't know who's on third. I was a youth pastor in the year 2000 in Atmore, Alabama. The caricature that you have in your mind of Alabama comes from Atmore, it comes from South Alabama, and that's where I was for a few years. At that church, I mean, it was the South. It was as Southern gets. And at that church, we would sing worship songs, and regardless of the worship genre the song was actually written in, it always came out in Southern gospel. I don't know if you know what Southern gospel is. It's basically Jesus country music. So we sang Jesus country music no matter what the song was. Whatever these guys sing today, whatever Mike was leading us in, it would have come out with a drawl and we would have had like a slide guitar. Like that's how it would. So in the church, I got to play just kind of a hobby of mine. I just enjoyed playing the piano. So sometimes I would play the piano for worship services. And I often got to play with a friend of mine named Jimmy, who played the bass. Jimmy was everything you think about when you think about a good old boy that dresses in camouflage and an orange hat and goes hunting and fishing and that is life, good salt of the earth guy. That was Jimmy. Jimmy played the bass, Southern gospel style. He, his sister, and a friend were a Southern gospel trio, and they traveled all over the South singing and ministering. They would go to different churches on the fifth Sunday. Do y'all know in the South, the fifth Sunday is Southern Gospel Night? That's where you go. So fifth Sundays, they would go sing. One night, we were at church, and I just so happened to be playing the piano for worship. Jimmy was playing the bass, and the minister came up to take up the offering. And back then, always in the South, but back then, when someone would take up the offering, someone else would come up and sing a special. Y'all remember that? Have y'all been in churches where someone comes up and sings a special? So that night, we had Frankie was going to sing a special. Frankie was relegated to Sunday night because he wasn't good enough to sing a song on Sunday morning. So he made the Sunday night cut, which meant that his heart was good, but his mouth not so much. So Frankie had a good heart, bless his heart. So Frankie was singing. The one thing that Frankie got right all of the time, 100% of the time, is Frankie knew how to pick the right song that would connect with the people in the pew. He knew how to pick the right song. And that night, Frankie chose the old Southern gospel standard called The Anchor Holds by Ray Boltz. The Anchor Holds goes like this. I'm not going to sing, I'm going to tell you the words. It goes like this. The anchor holds, though the ship is tattered, the anchor holds in spite of the storm. It's basically a metaphor of how when my life is being shaken, Jesus is close, he's the anchor. And you could feel as Frankie would sing, the further he got into the verses and into the chorus, the energy began to build in the room. Frankie had chosen the right song for the right night to the right group of people. And it built and it built and it built until finally we got to the end of it. And Frankie hit the last note. And by that I mean he almost hit the last note. And he's sang and he's belting it out with his pure heart and his average voice. and he's singing as loudly as he can. The anchor holds, and the place erupts in applause. And we're praising God, and our hands are in the air, and people are in Alabama. We say people are hooping and hollering. You just feel the life and the energy and the hope, and it's just a good place to be. And I look over at my friend Jimmy, and Jimmy could not be happier. He is literally he is being raptured into the glory of God. He's so into it. And I look over at Jimmy, and Jimmy's hooping and hollering. He's like, woo! I mean, it's somewhere between a duck call and a glory call. Jimmy is right there, woo! And he's going. And I look at Jimmy. Jimmy looks at me, and he goes, that right there is what we're going to sing in heaven. And I just thought, it just hit me weird. Like it took me out of the energy of the moment, and I went, what right there? And I said, Jimmy, what did you say? He said, that right there we're going to sing in heaven. And I said, the anchor holds? And Jimmy said, absolutely. And then I just could not be a smart aleck. I said, Jimmy, are you telling me that the angels that have been singing for eternity, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, the whole earth is filled with His glory, you're going to go tap them on the shoulder and say, just a minute, I've got a better song. The tribes and nations of the world gathered round the throne, the Africans and the Hispanics and the Asians and the Russians, were all throwing our crowns at Jesus' feet, and we're singing Southern gospel. And he said, what else would we sing? Jimmy, like we all do, are entrenched in our own understanding of who God is. We have a context. This is who God is, and this is how God acts. Blaise Pascal says this in the 17th century. On the sixth day, God created mankind in His image, and ever since then, mankind has been returning the favor. We all create a God in our minds that fits who we want Him to do and what we want Him to be. We have an image, a vision, an idea of who God is. And when God doesn't act like the God that we want Him to be, we get disillusioned or frustrated or angry at God for not acting like the God that we've created He should be. We've created a false image of God, an idol. God doesn't act like I want Him to act. He doesn't love the people that I want Him to love, and He doesn't hate the people that I want Him to hate. He doesn't vote the way that I want Him to vote. God doesn't act like who He's supposed to act like. Disappointment comes from unmet expectations. And when God doesn't act like I want Him to act, I get disappointed in God. And one of the hardest things that I have learned in my life and am learning in my life is that I create an image of God and say, this is who God is, and this is how God acts. And when God doesn't look or act like the way that I want Him to, it's easy for me to get frustrated or angry or disillusioned or even just sad. And Martha says to Jesus, you're not acting like you're supposed to act if you had been here, which means you should have been here. I've watched you act like God a lot, but you're not acting like God right now. You should have been here. How often in our lives do we tell God, this is what you should do? If you're really God, you would act this way. If you're really God, you would be like this. All disappointment and disillusionment with God that you and I will ever have comes from a false expectation that has come from an image we have created of God that He is not. My second point is this. God is God because He's God, not because He acts like God. God is God because He's God, not because He acts like God. Not because He acts the way you and I want Him to act. Not because He acts like the way that we think a God should act. Mary looks at Jesus and says, I know that my brother will rise again one day on the resurrection. And Jesus says, no. That's an image you've created, that there's this resurrection that I'm going to enact. I'm not enacting anything. I am resurrection. I am truth. I am life. I don't tell truth. I don't give life. I am truth. I am life. I don't enact resurrection. I am resurrection. You and I will experience death differently because Jesus wasn't changed by death. He changed death. When Jesus died, he wasn't changed by death. He changed what death has the power to do and to be. Everything that Jesus does, he transfigures. Nothing changes Jesus. Jesus is God. But everything that Jesus does is changed because Jesus did it. A way to think about it is this: nothing happens to Jesus except that which God wants to happen differently for you. Jesus experiences betrayal and suffering and temptation and baptism, not because any of those things change him, but because he changes what they are. Jesus experiences death so that he can change death to have the potential for resurrection. And resurrection is a wholly different thing than death. Jesus never dies. He changes death. Jesus isn't raised back to anything. He is resurrected. God does not save us from death, but he saves us through death, the death that he has changed forever. Verse 28, and I'm closing. Verse 28 says, after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here. She said, and is asking for you. And Mary heard this. She got up quickly and went to him. Verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She echoes Martha, her sister. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. Why does Jesus weep? He can't be sad because Lazarus is dead, because Lazarus is not dead. Jesus tells us he's asleep. Jesus tells us, we know when we look back in the story that he's about to walk over to a cave where death and sadness and tragedy and trauma and suffering live, and he's going to speak into it and call life out of it. Lazarus is going to walk out of the grave, and he is not dead. So why is Jesus weeping? He can't be sad because we've lost Lazarus, because we haven't lost Lazarus. Jesus is weeping because the people he loves are weeping. Where is Jesus in our pain and our suffering and our sorrow? The last point is this: Jesus sees, hears, feels, holds, and joins us in our pain. Where is Jesus in the suffering of my life, in the pain of my life, in the cavernous moments of my life? Where is Jesus? He is right there in the middle of it. Weeping with me, crying with me, sad with me, suffering with me. He is the suffering servant. Tiff passed away after 7 years of battling this disease. I held her hand when she breathed her last breath. In the last hour, her breathing would slow, and I remember praying one more time, Jesus, you can still do it. You can still heal her. I know you still can. She breathed her last breath. For the next 2 years, my kids, my 3 teenagers by this point, and I grieved and began to heal. We took trips. We enjoyed one another. We explored. We did counseling. And we healed. And after a couple years, I told my kids, I think I'm ready. I loved your mom so much. I love love. And I think I'm ready to love again. And I asked Hannah out on a date. And only by God's grace and her gluttony for punishment and pain did she say yes. At the beginning of right as we got ready to go on our first date, we were kind of talking, and I said to her, hey, listen, I think I'm done having kids. I'm a little older than Hannah. I said, I think I'm done having kids. Is that like a deal breaker for you? Because if it is, then let's go different ways. And she goes, no, it's not a deal breaker. I love you and I love the kids, and I would love to join your life. I said, great. So we did a very fast romance. It was a corona-mance, as a matter of fact. We were married during COVID. COVID was very good to me. And so we got married. And about 2 months in, we began to talk and say, are we sure we're done with our family? Are we finished? And I said, I remember saying these fateful words. Why don't we just let God decide? We won't try and we won't not try. And this is my family now. After 2 babies back to back, I said, God has spoken all he needs to over our family. We're going to shut her down. So this is the completion. Tetelestai. Like that, it is finished. But what I want to tell you is this, and I want to say it quickly, and then I want to pray for you, and it's this. In the greatest moments of pain and suffering in our life, Jesus is in the middle of it. And he stands. Life is a paradox. There are things that are true about life, and there are things that are true about life. And what I mean by that is we can stand to these moments that are difficult to understand because we are living a life of God reality. A different reality than just human, but a God reality. I love Tiffany, and I miss her, and I wish she never died. I don't want her to ever die. I wish she was here to braid my teenagers' hair and help me walk them down the aisle. They're 21.